We would like to get started tonight by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe Nation. We would also like to acknowledge this is the treaty lands of the First Nations of the Huron Tract, Treaty Number 29 from 1827, and thank them for sharing this land with us. We would also like to acknowledge that the Chippewas of the Kettle and Stony Point on the southern shores of Lake Huron are our closest Indigenous community. Welcome to our 100 Debates on the Environment. We would like to thank our audience members and candidates for attending this important evening. We would also like to welcome those of you who are tuning in via Rogers TV. 100 Debates on the Environment is a national organization with a mission to make the environment an issue that no party and no candidate can ignore. There are more than 100 inclusive, politically neutral, and environmental-focused all-candidate debates happening this evening in communities across Canada. Green Goderich is a local grassroots environmental action group based here in Goderich. Their main goal is to protect our natural resources through action to eliminate plastic pollution and both the causes and effects of climate change. They hope to inspire and unite people to support our ecosystems through education, action, and advocacy. Green Goderich has graciously agreed to be the local host for our environmental debate this evening. This federal election is coming at a huge tipping point for the future of the environment, and it is important that all voters are informed about the candidates' environmental platforms before casting our ballots on the 21st. I'm Jeff Bauer. I was born and raised right here in Huron County. I'm a real estate broker alongside my team, the Homefield Group at Royal LePage Heartland. I believe in giving back in any way that I can to the community that's given me so much, and I'm truly committed to creating a safe and sustainable community, an environment to raise my growing family in, and that's why I'm here tonight. The purpose of tonight's debate is to create a forum where voters will hear directly from candidates about their visions for the environment. We hope to spur meaningful government action towards a sustainable future. A little bit about tonight's format and rules. Candidates are seated alphabetically and will be introduced in that order shortly. Each candidate will be allotted 2 minutes to make an opening statement. The order of these statements was determined by a random draw earlier this evening. There will be a round of 4 questions that have been submitted by 100 Debates on the Environment, followed by 3 local questions submitted by local experts, followed finally by 3 audience questions from you. The order of the responses has been randomized. The candidates will have 2 minutes to respond in turn to each question. During the response time, candidates will be giving warning that time is running out at 30 seconds and 15 seconds, and obviously the microphone will be turned off at 0 seconds. Each candidate will be given 3 minutes for closing statements. The order will be a reverse order of the opening statements. Once the debate is complete, the audience is invited to stay and meet with the candidates until about 9:15. The candidates are not to interrupt the other candidates. Candidates are not to go over their allotted time. I will rule out of order all offensive and derogatory commentary or anything that attacks the integrity of a candidate or brings another reputation into disrepute. I will also rule out of order any person who attempts to use this meeting as a platform for grandstanding. We ask the candidates to respect one another by not speaking over one another. A reasonable decorum will be expected of the audience and candidates to ensure a fair and equitable discussion. No campaign-related information, buttons, banners, or posters are allowed in the debate room. I will ensure and maintain a productive and respectful environment. That's the goal. And if anyone acts out of line or fails to maintain a reasonable decorum, they will be asked to leave the event immediately. We take the security and respect of the candidates and audience very seriously. We ask the audience to respect the candidates and applaud good ideas rather than the candidates themselves. And again, please turn off your cell phones at this time. So, all of the local candidates were invited, and we're pleased to welcome in alphabetical order Ben Lobb of the Conservative Party of Canada, Tony McQuail of the New Democratic Party of Canada, Alan Thompson of the Liberal Party of Canada, and Nicholas Wendler of the Green Party of Canada. Each candidate will now be given 2 minutes to provide an opening statement. They will speak in the order drawn previously this evening, and the order will be Ben, Nicholas, Alan, and Tony. So, Ben, you have your 2 minutes started now.
Test 1, 2. Good evening. My name is Ben Lobb, and I'm the Conservative candidate for Huron Bruce. I'd like to thank the I'd like to thank the Huron Chamber and Green Goderich for hosting tonight's debate. I'd also like to congratulate GreenPAC and their 100 Debate Initiative. I'd like to congratulate all the candidates and thank everyone here in attendance tonight. Climate change is real. It's a global problem that will require decisive action at the local, provincial, and federal level. It's time for Canada to be a real leader and bring forward new and innovative solutions. A real plan to protect the environment is a balanced approach to reduce emissions at home, conserve and protect our air, land, water, wildlife, and take our fight against climate change global. Our plan has 3 guiding principles: green technology, not taxes, a cleaner and greener natural environment, and taking the climate change fight global, as I mentioned. We can encourage and support the development of green technology to make environmentally friendly alternatives available. We can do this without making the lives of Canadians harder and more expensive. A real plan to protect our environment builds on the important work that our farmers, hunters, anglers, Indigenous people, and volunteers do every day. Our new Conservative government would develop the Green Patent Credit, Green Technology and Innovation Fund, create a green hub for innovators, greening the grid, making renewable fuel a better option. And in 2017, over 200 billion liters of raw sewage was released into our waters by Canadian citizens and by Canadian cities and municipalities. We will end this practice. We'll maintain watershed protection for our Great Lakes. I believe our plan is the best environmental plan for Canada. I look forward to tonight's debate.
Thank you, Ben. Nicholas?
Good evening. I'm Nicholas Wendler from the for the Green Party of Huron Bruce. I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, to thank Green Goderich for hosting with Huron Chamber and GreenPAC for running these debates on the environment. It seems to be an important issue at this time. Since there's a climate crisis with weather patterns changing, temperatures rising in our oceans, mass extinctions of species coming if we don't pay attention and work to make changes. And we have a plan that will reduce greenhouse gases to 60% below the 2005 levels, keeping temperatures in line with what climate scientists say is required. Yeah.
Thank you, Nicholas. Just going to make sure they get the timer reset here, Alan. Okay, go ahead, Alan.
Good evening, everyone. I'd also like to thank our hosts. Thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. I think you're here because climate change represents an existential threat to our planet. Canadians all across the country joined those around the world last week, taking to the streets to demand stronger action. And I think anyone who seeks to be a leader in this community needed to be part of those events last week. I was happy to participate in the climate strike in Goderich, and I made sure that members of my campaign were also present in Kincardine and Port Elgin to engage with those who were taking part in those events. I was especially struck here in Goderich by the words of a young woman named Gwyneth Pella, who spoke and challenged us and said, "What next? You know, what do we do next about this?" She asked our political leaders to take action, and she said, the people want you to put the earth first. And I was pleased not only to be there with Gwyneth, but that she allowed me to walk with her and join in the demonstration. The Liberal Party has a plan to fight climate change that's ambitious and balanced and serious. In the past 4 years, we've done more to fight climate change than any previous government in Canada's history. We've done a lot, and there's a lot more to do, and we'll talk about that this evening. This election is critical for the environment, and please note all of the progress that we have made would be undone if Mr. Andrew Scheer is elected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. Next up, and wrapping up our opening statements, Tony McQuail.
Well, good evening, friends. I first ran nearly 40 years ago because I was concerned about the environment and also inequity in our society. And unfortunately, I'm running in 2019 because I'm still having to be concerned. But on my card, I have my 3 R's, and they're representation, regeneration, and redistribution. But for my opening remarks, I'd like to focus on representation, and I like audience participation. How many of you believe that your vote should count every election? Show of hands. How many believe that? How many? Yeah, okay. And how many believe that your neighbor's vote should count every election? Yeah. Well, that's how you build a democracy that actually discusses things rather than bickers about things when phony majorities have full control, and how you try and figure out what the majority of us will support for the long time. Democracy at its best lets us figure out what our collective wisdom is. And I've been really pleased that 40 years ago our collective wisdom wasn't that the planet was really important and underlaid everything that we do, but it's certainly getting there now. But our politicians and our elites haven't got up with us. And unfortunately, our current first-past-the-post system fails us. And let me show you an example. In 2004, the Greens got 587,000 votes. That should have translated proportionally into 13 seats. They didn't get any. Where would we be if that voice had been at the table in Parliament properly represented in 2004? In 2008, they got over 6% of the vote, over 940,000 votes. And again, got no representation, or maybe Elizabeth May got elected that time. I can't remember now. I'm getting older. But that should have been 21 seats. So let's vote for real.
Thanks, Tony. The following questions have been asked of all candidates participating in each of the 100 debates on the environment across the country this evening. We would like to know what you as an individual MP would do to help solve these environmental challenges. We're looking for you to go beyond stating what your party has done or will do. In your initial response to these questions, we ask that you avoid talking about what other parties are or are not doing. We will go in a randomized order for each. First question is in regards to climate change. So around the world, we are seeing inspiring examples of leadership to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and accelerate the shift to a green economy. At the same time, we are seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change, and the scientific consensus is that we have little more than a decade to turn things around. We see extreme weather events across the country, including wildfires, flooding, and droughts. These are causing anxiety and worry, given their enormous financial and environmental impact. Per person, Canadians produce the most greenhouse gas pollution of all G20 industrialized nations, nearly 3 times the G20 average and over 20 tons per person. Question: what are the key elements of an action plan that you will advocate for to ensure Canada meets its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas pollution? And Alan, we're starting off with you.
Well, first you start with the accomplishments of a mandate of 4 years, a government that is already putting in place a plan to tackle climate change, investing in more than 1,200 public transit systems, Putting a price on pollution. There has to be a price on carbon. And some of us disagree on this. This is a fundamental for me. Doubling the amount of nature protected, banning the use of single-use plastics. And a platform for reaching these goals, net zero emissions in Canada by the year 2050. Setting 5-year legislated benchmarks to reach those goals. Fighting climate change would be the law in this country. Engaging with the business community, cutting corporate tax rates in half for those who agree to work on the production of zero emission technologies. We not only have to reduce carbon by putting a price on carbon, we have to move very aggressively to create a new economy, the new technology that will help us to make this transition. We want to plant 2 billion trees in the next 10 years to increase the carbon that can be stored in nature. Invest in clean power, making electric vehicles more affordable, and it goes on and on. I mean, this is a fundamental, it's a cornerstone of our election platform, and it should be. All you have to do is stand in a place like the square in Goderich last Friday and listen to those voices and realize we're the first generation to fully realize the danger posed by climate change, and also the first to maybe have time to do something about it. Thank you.
Ben?
Thanks very much for the question. First and foremost, a hard cap for large emitters. We need to do that, and if the large emitters can't meet their targets, then they're going to have to invest in a green technology fund to help solve their problems. That's first and foremost. In addition to that, we're also looking at a green home tax credit. 12% of the emissions come from your home, believe it or not, in Canada. And so anything that we can do to make your home more energy efficient, I think is great, and reduce our carbon footprint at home. Technology is going to really help us out, obviously conservation as well. The Green Technology Innovation Fund, that'll be something that we set up as well. Every dollar the government invests, we'll have $4 from the private sector invest to find the solutions for the future. And in addition to that, Alan did mention it as well, but the greening of the grid. In Ontario, we're likely one of the only jurisdictions in North America to meet our targets, and it's not due to really any government intervention except for shutting down coal-fired power plants and relying more on nuclear energy. That's about half our grid, as many of you know here today. And we can all remember the smog days of years gone by. And fortunately for us, that Bruce Power and Darlington and Pickering were there to do the job and provide a steady baseload for our province here. There's opportunities in northern and remote regions. If we really work on the technology with nuclear to have small reactors to reduce the need for diesel generators in northern and remote communities, obviously large emitters. And we do need to fix our traffic problem that we have in our large urban areas. Anybody that's traveled through Toronto realizes it's a bottleneck. It used to be around Mississauga, now it's at Kitchener, and it's really not acceptable. Here in our rural areas, it's pretty tough. We don't have the ability to really do mass transit, but fortunately our vehicles are much more fuel efficient and produce far less exhaust. So that's some of the ideas on GHG. Thank you.
Tony?
Could I get a clarification on the question? Because I understood you to ask what we would do personally. Because I did spend a bunch of the afternoon coming up with a bunch of stuff from our New Deal for People, but I don't think that was your question.
The question is, what are the key elements of an action plan that you will advocate for to ensure Canada meets its international obligations to reduce GHG?
Okay, so that isn't the. It's what I would personally advocate for, which in fact is what is in our parties document. I would encourage you to look at NDP commitments. Google it, because you can find this. It's a comprehensive plan that addresses climate change while making life more affordable for Canadians. We declare the climate emergency and adopting the greenhouse gas emission levels that for 2030 to stabilize global temperatures at 1.5 degrees C. We would set up a climate accountability office to regularly audit how we're doing and report to the public, have the funds to report to the public on that. We're also planning to stop subsidizing fossil fuel industry and put a 1% tax on wealth over $20 million, so we actually have some money to put into the things that need to be done, such as retrofitting and those sorts of things. And we will maintain the carbon pricing and household rebates, but roll back the breaks that were given to big polluters on carbon pricing, and also introduce methane reduction targets. We plan to move the federal fleet to an electric fleet by 2025 and work to get federal buildings carbon neutral by 2030, set a target for carbon-free electricity by 2030, and create a Canadian climate bank to invest in renewable energy projects and community efforts to reduce carbon and to be more energy efficient. Also moving the benefit for investing in or buying a zero-emission vehicle from 5,000 going to 15,000, and in partnership with the provinces and territories, fund energy-efficient retrofits on housing units and government buildings, and hopefully target retrofitting all Canada's housing stock by 2050, with half of that completed by 2030, with loans that are repayable through the savings on the energy that is being saved. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And Nicholas.
Having a strict target is important. As I noted, I think earlier, the party would have 60% reduction below of greenhouse gases, including methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide, below the 2005 levels by 2030, and a net zero by 2050, including a declining legal emissions for industries, with to keep temperatures below or from rising above 1.5 degrees. Carbon pricing is important. Maintaining a revenue neutral carbon fee on all sources of carbon dioxide pollution, with dividends to be returned to Canadians, and that things like electric vehicles could be saved for that way. I was thinking, and it's important to have a non-partisan cross-party intercabinet to deal with the climate emergency, rather than and overcome barrier partisan politics. We wouldn't have any new fossil fuel projects, cancel the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and fossil fuel subsidies, including LNG. Viable oil and gas wells will transitioned into produce geothermal energy, and work.
Thanks, Nicholas. The next question is about water, and we'll be starting off with Ben. So many Canadians know that our country has the longest coastline in the world. Less well known is that Canada is home to roughly half of the world's lakes and roughly 10% of the world's wetlands. Canada is seeing the impact that industrial development and climate change is having on our water resources. We are seeing the reemergence of pollution hotspots like Lake Erie. And the Insurance Bureau of Canada notes that since the 1970s, there has been a massive 250% increase in natural disasters, including floods and droughts that are likely related to climate change. Question: what can the federal government do to work with different sectors like municipalities and farmers to reduce both water pollution and the risk of flood events which have been aggravated by industrial development and climate change? Ben.
Okay, well, first of all, I know there's a few farmers in the crowd here tonight, and I think that they would want me to also point out what I made in my original comment, that there's 200 billion liters of raw sewage that gets dumped into our waterways from cities and municipalities. So first of all, we need infrastructure. We need dollars for infrastructure to make that get to zero. I think that's vitally important. In addition to that, I'd also like to point out that our Nutrient Management Act has been in place for many, many years. And there are regions in the United States that don't have that. They don't even know what it is. And so I think we're really leaders in Ontario, and our farmers in our area realize that we are the last line of defense before you get to Lake Huron. And so I think that is an important point to make. And if anybody's had the chance to go behind Huron View and see some of the projects that Huron Crop and Soil have done, really doing some fantastic studies on drainage, managing the level of water in the soil, retention ponds, a number of different projects like that. It's fantastic to see academia, experts, farmers, industry all work together to really understand and manage the flow of water in the soil, on top of the soil, etc. And let's not forget, there's a lot of farmers out there now who are going to no-till, to not disturb the soil. They're planting cover crops in the fall to maximize the value of their cropland. Other ideas as well, septic inspections. They seem to have gone quite well in certain municipalities that have taken that on. I think that's a good idea. In addition as well, I really believe in our areas, our urbanized areas around cities, we've plowed down a tremendous amount of farmland, wetlands, and I really think that it's time for us to really look at the impact of what storm drains have done to our water levels in our rivers, and really what the impact has that had, because it's really crazy when you go around the cities and see how many thousands of acres of farmland.
Thanks, Ben. Tony?
Well, we're talking about expanding federal funding to respond to disasters and support communities in proactively putting in infrastructures to withstand floods, forest fires, and other extreme weather events. But I also think we have to recognize that it's the land first that the water hits, and it's the land that we need to be thinking about looking after. So I was involved in helping set up the environmental farm plan in Ontario in the 90s under that NDP government. And I think what we need to be thinking toward is a regenerative farm plan across the country that would work with farmers in all the provinces to look at how could they. And the beauty of the environmental farm plan or a regenerative farm plan is it helps an individual farmer think through how they would manage their resource base in a way that would make it better for the environment, or in this case, better in terms of soil organic matter, which will hold and retain water much more effectively. And so what this kind of program could do would be reduce the amount of water running off, taking pollutants with it as well, and increase the resilience to farms, both in the face of flooding and in the face of drought. Because if you raise soil organic matter by about 1%, it'll increase that soil's water holding capacity by about 25,000 gallons of water, which then if you get into a drought situation is a great boon to have there. So it's a potentially win-win situation. Another component of that could be a plan to look at how to increase biodiversity, because as we increase biodiversity on farms, we increase the beneficial predatory and parasitic insects, the beneficial insectivorous birds, and we actually create an ecosystem for the farm that's much more conducive to a healthy farm production and system. So those are things that I would really like to support.
Thanks, Tony. Nicholas?
It would be important to develop a national water strategy to ensure safe drinking water. We had a national water strategy delivered in the late 1980s. It was never fully implemented. So, in collaboration with the provinces, territories, and with all levels of government and Indigenous peoples, it'd be important to develop the strategy and fully implement it. And we would protect a minimum of 30% of fresh water and land by 2030. Climate-proof drinking water and wastewater systems to protect against flooding, droughts, and contamination. Protect watersheds and wetlands through increasing green infrastructure. A national program to restore buffer zones around waterways through planting trees and soil rebuilding. Support farmers in protecting wildlife habitat areas, water quality and soil quality on their lands.
Thank you, Nicholas. And Alan.
The climate crisis is part of our daily lives in our own community. In our community, there are several thousand people live and work in flood and erosion-prone areas in the Maitland, Saugeen, Asabo Valley watersheds. There are more than 800 homes and cottages along the Lake Huron shoreline that are at risk from shoreline erosion, bluff collapse, gully erosion. The total value of that land and property, $366 million. This is very real in our community. We've had 3 major flood events just in the last decade or so: December 2008, June 2017, and February 2018. And I was happy, along with Tony and Nicholas, to be at an event this morning hosted by the Carbon Footprint Initiative, which is linked to the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority, where they invited candidates to come for a really good briefing on the impact that the climate crisis is having in our community and some of the proposed local strategies for dealing with that. Now, the Liberal government had already created a $2 billion disaster mitigation adaptation fund, and this is to help communities to prepare for climate change through more resilient infrastructure. The platform is making a commitment for a further $1 billion to that plan. But Phil Beard from the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority made very clear at the meeting this morning, he doesn't think it goes far enough, this plan. And it sort of gets into the technical details, but the way municipalities can access those funds. So I think there's just room to do more and to see how we can address the climate crisis in our own community.
All right, thank you. The next question is in regards to the wilderness conservation. And Tony, heads up, you'll be starting this one. When asked about what they love most about our country, Canadians often point to natural beauty, wildlife, and spectacular wilderness areas. Yet we're falling below our international commitments to protect these spaces, and our parks and other protected areas are not funded at the level needed to conserve the diverse plants and animals that live there. A recent study shows that 50% of Canadian wildlife spaces are in decline. 87% of Canadians value the emotional and physical benefits of spending time in nature. However, 82% say that they're concerned that future generations won't have close or easy access to nature. Question: what will you do to protect the quality and quantity of wilderness in Canada?
The NDP is talking of protecting 30% of our land, fresh water, and oceans by 2030 and backing that protection with funding and enforcement. We'll also work with other levels of government to develop a system of urban national parks so that people in urban areas have closer access to wilder areas, and a national approach to tree planting and reforestation that's based on a much more ecological mix of things. But I'd also like to touch on something that I think we all need to think about, and that is, where does our, I teach a holistic management course with Fran, which is about helping farmers think through how to have healthy land, healthy people, and healthy profit. It was one of the early triple bottom line management approaches. And one of the things we try to do in thinking about problems is think about what's the root cause of the problem. And the root cause of our problem isn't CO2. As a farmer, I work with CO2. I grow plants that take it out of the atmosphere, turn it into biomass, put a bunch of it into the soil, and create a bunch of stuff that we can either sell or feed to animals that we sell. So CO2 isn't the problem itself. It's the level on which we use energy. And one of the things that I think it's really important that we think about as we grapple with these issues is we need to rethink how we do things. We need to redesign what we do. You know, you were all issued with a transportation device. It's called feet. And you were all issued with a fuel tank and a vent for that fuel tank. It's called your mouth and your digestive system. And if we started to rethink how do we do the things that we need to do as a society with the food we put in our mouths and with the energy that gives our bodies, we'd be in a very different place. And we might be able to solve a number of our problems because it's the intensity and volume of our energy use.
Thank you, Tony. Nicholas, you're up.
Increasing funding to federal departments for species protection to ensure that species are protected. We would have indigenous-led protected areas and conserved areas. By indigenous guardians, fully restore the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act to its pre-Harper era strength. Increase funding to Parks Canada to protect ecological integrity and develop national forest strategy that's evidence-based in partnership with Indigenous peoples in the provinces and territories of Canada.
Thank you, Nicholas. Alan?
So I grew up on the edge of the Greenock Swamp, one of this country's greatest wetlands. And we had a pond back in the field behind the farm, and I was privileged to spend a lot of my childhood looking for turtles, tadpoles, salamanders, and this is a really important experience that I wish everyone could have. And protecting that nature is really, really critical. This government, a Liberal government, has already gone from protecting less than 1% of our oceans in 2015 to just under 14% now. That's a very significant increase. For land and inland waters, we've gone up from 10.5 to 12.56%, and we're stepping up those efforts. Our platform would propose new goals: 25% protection for land and 25% protection for oceans by 2025 and going up to 30% by 2030. And another announcement that was made recently that some people made light of was the idea of making it possible for lower income families to enjoy a holiday in one of our national parks. And I think that's very important, that we all get to enjoy the nature that we are privileged to have in abundance in this country. It's part of that responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. And go ahead, Ben.
17% for land and 10% for marine, for protection. In addition, we need to look at what we're going to do for invasive species. And we can think about what we've witnessed here locally with the devastating effects of the emerald ash borer. And certainly it's a native tree, and it's an important tree, or it was an important tree along our coastline, certainly. The risk associated with Asian carp and our freshwater fish habitat along the lake. And of course, we all know about the impacts that the zebra mussels have had in Lake Huron as well with our fish habitat. So certainly we need to make sure that there are significant investments, and I believe when we were in government, we made those investments, and I think the government in today has also carried on that to make sure that we do have the protections, and I think that's vitally important for our natural habitat. Protecting migratory birds, certainly important, and we're going to reinstate our hunting and angling panel. Vitally important that we hear the people who are closest, in many cases, to our natural environment and our wildlife, to hear from them, to not only make sure we have healthy herds, but that they're managed correctly. And also, if you look back what we started a number of years ago with Rouge River National Park, I think that's a huge success on the urban front to see one of the largest national parks in an urban setting. So there's a lot that we can do. And again, I've mentioned earlier in our managed wetlands around our urban areas, we have to do a much better job as Canadians to make sure those aren't devastated by urban sprawl. And far, far too many of them have been, and we have to do a much better job municipally, provincially, and federally.
Thanks, Ben. The final question from the 100 Debates group is on the topic of pollution and toxic substances. Nicholas, you'll be answering first to this question. Canada has made big strides to improve our health and environment by regulating toxic substances. Legal limits on lead in gasoline, restricting chemicals like DDT and ozone-depleting substances, the Canada-US Acid Rain Agreement, and the phase-out of coal-fired electricity have had enormous impact on our well-being by saving lives, preventing illnesses, and saving billions of dollars in avoided healthcare costs. However, air pollution is still a leading cause of death and illness in Canada. In addition, our laws and regulations have not kept pace with emerging threats from newer toxic substances in our environment, including from pesticides in our food and other harmful chemicals in everyday consumer products. Many of these substances have demonstrated links to cancer, genetic damage, developmental problems, chronic illness, and many other health effects. These effects are often more severe for children and other vulnerable populations. Our overarching toxics law, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has not been significantly strengthened in 20 years. Question: what will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impact of toxic substances? Will you commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Products Act? Go ahead, Nicholas.
Yeah, we would strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, limiting approval and use of toxic chemicals that affect health and environment, and regulate microfibers as a toxic substance. Legislate a right to a healthy environment including public participation rights, transparency in decision-making, wider access to judicial review in court. We'd improve monitoring of pesticides, including the health impacts, reduce the use of pesticides in agriculture, and support farmers in the transition, including ban on neonicotinoids and ban on forestry and cosmetic uses of glyphosate-based herbicides. And creating an adverse effects reporting database for doctors and emergency rooms to keep track of health impacts of pesticides and other chemicals.
Thanks, Nicholas. Alan?
As a government, we've committed to eliminating coal by 2030, something that will lead to a major reduction in mercury emissions, one of the most toxic substances on the planet. Our investments in green infrastructure will help reduce pollution that's made its way into our waterways. Our plan to ban single-use plastics will mean less microplastics in our environment, in our water sources, and in our food systems. When I think about Gwyneth Pella's call for us to think about what next, you know, I look back 4 years ago, being on the campaign trail, you would have found a case of water bottles in the back of my vehicle. I will admit, they're cheap and quick and easy. And this time around, we just don't need them. We don't need those bottles anymore. And I suspect I went through hundreds of them as an individual over the course of those few months of that very, very long election campaign. And this time I haven't used a single one. And I think that's something that we can all do. I salute groups in our Green Goderich, our host, and also groups like Blue Bayfield, which have been real leaders in moving forward and taking those simple steps to facilitate ending the use of these single-use plastics. So there's a lot that we can do. I think we need to keep asking ourselves this question, what next? The government that I support banned the import, sale, use of asbestos and products containing asbestos. And we have also committed, the final part of your question, to introducing a bill to reform the Canadian Environmental Protection Act as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Ben?
Thanks very much. When I was chair of the Health Committee, we had the opportunity to review the Pest Control Product Act, and it was fascinating to hear both sides, from industry, from different environmental groups, and really hear from both sides, obviously. And we had the pest management regulatory agency appear, their executive director. And the one thing that I think stuck with all the committee members, regardless of your political stripes, was it has to be based on science. It can't be based on an article in a newspaper. It can't be based on what you hear at the coffee shop. Every decision that they make, they're a public service. They're highly skilled, well-educated, in most cases, scientists working on this. They're testing, they're safeguarding everything that we use in our daily lives, and they're making sure that it's safe to use. They're making sure that it's safe to be used in our fields, and that it's safe for us to consume. And so we need to make sure that that agency, that department is funded, and is funded well, and they continue to do the job that it needs to do. And the PMRA also works with the EPA, it works with the European regulatory body as well, to make sure that they're not missing anything, to make sure that they're staying up to date. The other thing I'll say, we talked a little bit about coal and carbon. There's technology, carbon capture, carbon sequestration, that can make huge strides. We can transfer that technology around the world. And again, I'll say this, I sound probably like a broken record, but our CANDU nuclear technology, it's a great story. It is a fantastic story, and we need to really continue to push and support that technology around the world and help reduce emissions in high polluting countries like India and China. Thank you.
Sorry, Ben, I'm just going to follow up for a second. Just for part of that question, I just wanted, there was a question, will you commit to strengthening Canadian Environmental Protection Act? I just would, if the party were to be elected, is there anything?
Well, I think that's part of the review. It's an ongoing review anyways. That's not a hard and fast act to begin with. It's an act that, as times change, would always be considered and updated, obviously.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Tony.
Okay. The NDP is talking about enshrining in law the right to a healthy environment through a federal Environmental Bill of Rights and through a strengthened Canadian Environmental Protection Act. We're also committed to investing in public agricultural research, which can help farmers find alternative ways to manage weeds and pests. And certainly, one of the challenges of a science-based approach, if you're talking a reductionist, one control variable experiment approach in science, is the things we're trying to study in biological systems are often complex webs of interactions. And so it's very hard to get an accurate sense of how a pesticide ramifies through the environment. And this was brought home to me when I was at the University of Guelph in the tree science program. And what they discovered was when you introduced a toxic pesticide in to control something like codling moth in apples, you killed the codling moth off for a while, but you also created a whole new array of pests, because by introducing the pesticide into the system, you killed off predatory and parasitic insects which were controlling leaf miner and scab and scale and mites, and now their predators and parasites were no longer there, and they became a problem, and the codling moth came back, because when you spray, you kill the codling moth, you kill its predators, and then after the spray event, codling moths that were a little resistant or were under a leaf and didn't get hit are still surrounded by their food supply. But the beneficial, the predators and parasites, no longer have anything to eat, or if they do find something to eat, it's poisoned. And so we have disrupted many of the controls in our agricultural system and now have to do it ourselves. When you kill off the beneficials, it ends up the job goes to you as the farmer, and that can become very expensive in terms of chemicals and others. So helping develop systems that will help farmers.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you. So we're moving on now to the local questions that were established by some local experts in the area. So question 1 is in regards to research funding and legislative change, and this one will start with Ben. The Huron Bruce and its shorelines are home to a number of ecological treasures, including several globally rare ecosystems and federally listed species at risk. Past federal governments have funded a number of research projects on these ecosystems and species, and the Huron Fringe and Bruce Peninsula are currently nominated as national priority places for species at risk conservation. When research is completed, actionable items proposed by experts related to these rare ecosystems and species at risk are rarely funded, and few legislative changes result directly from scientific recommendations. Question: what will you do to continue funding scientific research on our natural environment, and how will you use the findings of this research to enact science-based legislation? Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, thank you for the question. And I think one of the important points of funding, or for funding programs, is it actually helps local, in our case, local conservation authorities. And I know we have a representative here tonight from the Asabo Bayfield Conservation Authority. And I think our program that we had years ago was called an Eco Action program, and it helped fund different educational programs inside the Conservation Authority. And again, I think Kate's here tonight and she can correct me, but just an education program for kids. If they're in the river and they see like a mussel, you guys have probably been in there and seen that, to not crack them open and destroy that species. It seems like something small, but it's very important. In addition to that, a project just south of town here at the Hindmarsh Farm. That's one in which we were trying, the project was to try and slow the water down. There's a 25-foot drop, believe it or not, from the east end of the farm to the west end of the farm. And that's to try and help slow the flow of water so that we do not have the gully erosion and the bank erosion. Projects like that that are from Ottawa or from Toronto that impact us and benefit us here locally at home are fantastic projects, and we should do more like that. It should be easier to access them. I know it's unfortunate in some cases, conservation authorities almost have to hire full-time people to apply for these applications. So things like that make a big difference. And again, our rural infrastructure, full stop. Bayfield needs a sewer expansion. Teeswater needs a sewer expansion. The Teeswater River flows obviously into Lake Huron as well. There's communities up and down our shoreline that need infrastructure, and they're our last line of defense into Lake Huron and all our rivers and streams that we love. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Nicholas, you're up.
I would say advocating for scientific research, it's beneficial to programs. Strengthening funding for the research and taking the actionable items that we find and actually implementing them into legislation and advocating for that, for them to be acted on. And allowing scientists that have done the research to openly address the public with their findings. Allowing the public to put pressure on the government when they're familiar with the information to act on what matters to them.
Thank you, Nicholas. And next up, Tony.
New Democrats support science-based decision-making and also transparent decision-making so that you know what went into making the decision. We're proposing additional fisheries and oceans research, auditing our climate change actions and reporting on that auditing so that we have a way of letting Canadians know whether we're meeting our goals or not, and certainly establishing those based on science, and also reinvesting in public agricultural research. But as I said, there are also limits to what reductionist science can tell you in a timely fashion. And sometimes it tells you wrong because it's only looking at one part of a whole biological network or system. So I think also from my own, I'm not saying this is in the platform because at least I haven't seen it there, but the whole idea of the precautionary principle, when in doubt, don't, that stood me in really good stead as a teenager. I found that really helpful. And the other one was, if it's worth doing sober. Those, I think, having watched a few field parties and other things, but that might not be a bad advice for a whole society. Let's not get drunk on our energy use, and let's maybe be a little more precautionary if we're going to leave a place for our children and grandchildren. So certainly science-based, but also being really well aware of the limitations on science in assessing all the risks in complex biological systems. My dad told me that one of the real selling points for cars was that it got rid of horse manure in cities. Well, who would have thought 100 years later that we might be crashing the climate because of our love and addiction to fast-moving machines? No?
Thanks, Tony. You're up, Alan.
I think it's worth going back, remembering 4 years ago, it was not a given that we would have a government that based decisions on science and evidence and research. And let's remember, we have restored respect for our scientists and researchers and science-based decision-making in this country. I would absolutely support scientific research to support the preservation of our natural ecosystems. I think we should go further. We should have an environmental Bill of Rights. I know that my party would support creating such a thing. In fact, the Liberal government did support a private member's bill put forth by an NDP member to establish an environmental Bill of Rights. I would work with my party, members of all parties, to create, support, implement a bill that would be substantive, effective, and based on science. And locally, we need to support our conservation authorities. They're in the vanguard. We learned this morning. They're the ones that can help us to understand better what the climate crisis really means in our own community. And sadly, we have seen a provincial government that has simply torn away fundamental funding and support for conservation authorities. And Jeff, I was really glad to hear you make a territorial acknowledgement at the beginning of this debate. I think, unless I'm mistaken, that's the first that we have had in these debates. So I think perhaps we should really look seriously at supporting learning about traditional, indigenous, environmental knowledge to help inform our environmental preservation.
Thank you, Alan. The next question is in regards to agriculture. And Tony, you'll be giving our first response. Climate change is impacting our farming system through sporadic weather patterns, including drought, extreme weather events, and increased year-to-year unpredictability. This was evidenced in Huron Bruce this spring, where extreme rainfall led to challenges for agricultural producers across many sectors. As one of the national leaders in agricultural production, Huron Bruce also has the opportunity to be a leader in innovation in the face of climate change. Question: what do you believe are the most important changes that we should make to our agricultural systems to promote resilience and sustainability, and how will you work to implement these changes in Huron Bruce?
Well, 40 years ago, Fran and I helped start the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario, which was a group of farmers, at the time 15, getting together to learn from each other's successes and mistakes. And that was one of the beauties of it. We shared our mistakes so that we didn't all have to make the same mistakes, in how to try and farm in a way that was more in line with the way the natural ecosystem manages things. And so certainly working to look at our current agricultural system and think about how to move it to a more regenerative and sustainable system is, I think, very important for the farm community and very important for the food eating community. And there are so much we can do, that we've learned so much more about soil biology in the last couple decades, and the incredible complexity of soil life and the importance of it in terms of nourishing plants and sequestering carbon in the soil, that a lot of what we were taught when I was in university, I mean, when I was there, the crop science guy said, forget cover crops, you no longer need them. Well, today we know that cocktail crops, multi-species cover crops do an incredible job of sequestering carbon, preventing weeds, and building soil organic matter, and can be utilized in an existing crop system in the interspaces between commercial crops. And certainly in grazing management, we've learned how to manage grazing in a way that builds soil carbon and makes animal production very carbon neutral or positive. So there's stuff that we can do, and that's why I think a regenerative farm plan that involves people with peer review and developing programs that work on individuals' farms. In the Ecological Farmers Association, we've started a farmer-led research program that's looking at all these sorts of things, and it's really exciting.
Thank you, Tony. Alan?
Farmers are among the first to realize the impact of climate change, global warming. I mean, it's their daily lives. Agricultural organizations, educators, producers are on the forefront of building climate change resilient technology and practices. And they need their government to make greater investments in the kind of research and development that is going to assist them and assist farmers who are making this transition to alternative methods. We can also look at diversifying how we farm. And Ben referred to this, zero tillage, agroforestry, and ensuring that we're using safe alternatives to neonicotinoid pesticides so we're not impacting on our biodiversity. There are innovations all around us. Again, let's look for solutions in our own community. And this morning, one of the members of the Carbon Footprint Initiative is the Molesworth Farm Supply, just on the edge of Huron County. And they talked about cutting, just one small example, cutting by close to 10% the power required to get feed in. And it's simply a case of instead of using blowers, using augers. And creating a new technology, a new way of moving feed. A re-elected Liberal government would increase its support to farmers to create and implement risk management programs so they can be protected, they and their crops, from risks that are beyond their control.
Thanks, Alan. Nicholas?
Transitioning from industrial to regenerative agriculture would be important in this to strengthen soil and it would reduce heavy use of fertilizers that can lead to other problems like fertilizer-fueled algal blooms that can be harmful and harmful to lakes and coastal zones.
Thanks, Nicholas. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, first I would make a statement that the farmers in Huron and Bruce County are world class, and they are leaders, and they always have been leaders. And so I think we need to start off by saying that because it's important to say that. And I think at the same time, we should also say that the agriculture community moves away faster than government does and government bureaucrats. So in a lot of ways, I think government needs to stay out of the way in many of the cases. In regards to what we can do, well, we have a research station in Centralia. We can continue to support that for innovation. Alan mentioned business risk management, but also on the non-business risk management side, innovation, to continue to foster innovation programs that will work in clusters, but also work in on-farm so that we can continue to push the envelope. There's no doubt about that. Tri-party funding, that's what I had written down. We've done projects in the past. One example was near Hensel with the white bean farmers, white beans, Guelph University, and Hensel Co-op. That was a great partnership. We need to do more of that. I've mentioned crop and soil here in county and in Bruce County. Cover crops, Tony mentioned those. Technology. Think of where we come on GPS technology in the last 10 years. That was pretty well non-existent 10 years ago. Now, pretty well every farmer in here in Bruce County relies on it in some way, shape, or form to do herbicide management, pesticide management, fertilizer management to maximize profits and minimize the impact with all three that I mentioned. So we have done tremendous work here in Bruce, and some of the farmers that we have here, they're young, they're curious, and they're willing to take chances, and it's fantastic to see it happen right here in Bruce County.
Thanks, Ben. The next question is regarding shoreline development. And Alan, you'll be first off for this one. Huron Bruce is home to the shorelines of Lake Huron with sandy bluffs, beautiful beaches, and breathtaking views. These shorelines have become a premier tourist and recreation destination. As use of the shoreline increases, so too does pressure on their natural systems, both on land and in water. Question: what will you do to promote ecologically sustainable development along our shorelines while encouraging visitors and residents to continue to discover and enjoy all that Huron Bruce has to offer? Go ahead, Alan.
Well, I promise you this will be the last time I mention the Greenock Swamp. But I have always thought, having grown up on the edge of this remarkable 12,000 acre wetland with incredible species, orchids, wildflowers, wild cats, animals that you can't find in other places, an incredible history. Sadly, I guess, it was part of our economic heritage. We exploited that swamp to no end by drawing out the white pine, virgin stands of white pine. It was central to our economy. So as part of our history, now thanks to largely the Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority, it continues to exist as a protected area, as a conservation area. And I have often wondered, can we not somehow find a way to create awareness of a remarkable resource like that swamp through ecotourism? And this is about finding that balance. Where do we find the balance of getting young people in particular into an area like that so they can explore? And the good news is this is already starting to happen. The Saugeen Valley Conservation Authority has seen it as part of its mandate to begin really sort of tentative steps in an ecotourism project in the Greenock Swamp, and taking tours in both to explore the incredible biodiversity of that area, but also to have a bit of fun and remind people that this was also a haven for bootleggers in the 1920s during Prohibition. And I think Emerson Caldwell on the edge of Glamis still had a still into the 1970s or 80s. So just one example how in our own community, in our own backyard, we should find a way, I think, to create awareness and build ecotourism in a place like Greenock Swamp.
Thanks, Alan. Ben?
Thank you for the question. In the shoreline, there's kind of a number of different scenarios here with our shoreline. We have part of our shoreline that is a bluff, and then we have part of our shoreline like Grand Bend and Point Clark and other spots where it's flush to the water. And so where one would be dunes and beach grass and the preservation and education of those systems that are vitally important, there's that. With the rising levels of Lake Huron in the last couple of years, contrasting the drop that we saw about 5 or 6 years prior, we have extreme pressure now on the banks along the bluff system. So that is an issue that needs to be dealt with because people love their properties along the lake, and we've got to make sure that they don't collapse into Lake Huron, like we see along the shorelines in California. In addition to that, most of the municipalities in Huron Bruce have completed their latest rounds of their master plan and their official plan in accordance with the planning at the provincial level, and they've set aside what they feel is appropriate. And most of the development is set here in Huron and Bruce County for how dense we can build along the shoreline. So it's pretty well set. There are opportunities, though. Virtually every home along Lake Huron operates on a septic system, with the exception of our communities like Bayfield and Goderich and Kincardine, but every point in between operates on a septic system. There could be some opportunities there to look at sewer systems up and down the coastline. And I will mention again the Hindmarsh Farm. That's just not the only situation up and down our coastline where we have huge slopes that cause a lot of water pressure and stress and strain on our bluffs and on our gullies. So lots of opportunities.
Thanks, Ben. And Nicholas?
I was thinking increase funding to allow protection of the shoreline with safe areas for people that allow for ecosystems to thrive, allow the residents and visitors to access what the areas have to offer as well.
Thanks, Nicholas. Tony?
At the national level, the NDP is talking about developing a national freshwater strategy to work with the provinces and territories to protect our waterways that are under international agreements. We'll also reverse the harmful changes brought in by the Conservatives by fully restoring the navigable waters protections for all Canada's lakes and rivers and invest in research to support freshwater protections. We're also talking about supporting municipalities that proactively invest in infrastructure to protect from extreme weather events. But certainly in terms of our own community, working with municipalities to figure out what kind of development and what kind of traffic our beaches and our bluffs and our resources can handle without being damaged, and then doing better education with the people who are using those resources so that they understand the importance of protecting dune vegetation and those sorts of things. The other thing, if we're going to try and increase tourism, something that has been of interest to me since I got a little book probably 50 years ago called Stop the 5-Gallon Flush, is the potential to use modern technologies for composting toilets and other ways which would be far, far less expensive than trying to create sewage treatment systems for lakeshore development. And so we need to be creative in thinking about how do we take what we've thought of as waste and turn it into resources, whether it was horse manure in New York City or humanure along the coasts of Lake Huron. So, this is the kind of creativity we need to be thinking about, and that I would certainly like to help our communities, because we have I hitchhiked across Canada in 1972 looking at what kind of farmland was available. I'd worked at Bissett Brothers, and I'd been a hired hand working 13 out of 14 days a week. I got every other Sunday off, so I hadn't had a chance to look around very much. So I hitched across, and I came back to Huron County because, man, the Huron Bruce borderline where we live, wonderful farm country, great climate, and beautiful, beautiful area. We have a lot to offer. And part of that is helping people understand the rural communities, because, boy, when I drive into Toronto to do a meat delivery or something for the farm, people need to get in touch with what we have here, but they need to get in touch in a way that doesn't destroy it. And so that's something we've got to be really creative about.
Thank you, Tony. All right, so next up is our audience questions. There are a number of questions in here, so thank you for the submissions. Who's answering first? That's a good question. Question 1, it'll be Nicholas answering first. Oh, sorry. Here, let's... yeah. All right. All right, the topic of this is also farmland. And actually, the question is addressed to Alan. So Alan, you will be answering first on this one. Okay. So, question. Since many of our food consumers are moving away from choosing dairy and meat, what is our government doing to encourage smaller entrepreneurs to get into plant-based agriculture versus the mega farm, which increasingly dominates our rural agricultural land? Sure will. I'll just do the synopsis. What is our government doing to encourage smaller entrepreneurs to get into plant-based agriculture versus the mega farm, which increasingly dominates our rural agricultural land?
So I grew up on a family farm. I didn't end up farming, as might be obvious. But it's a sad commentary that there's no one left in my family farming. And we have seen a pretty dramatic shift in the way farming is done and how it figures into our economy, but also how it figures into our community and how we develop, how we use land, how we share our resources. That's a pretty complicated question for a 2-minute answer, and I have to admit it's one that I would have to think about quite a bit more. But I do think there have been a lot of examples of initiatives to eat local, to buy local, to access products that come from our own communities. And that is a way that we can encourage these small entrepreneurs by buying their products, by visiting a market, by taking a grocery bag that's reusable and heading to the market and filling it up with local produce.
Thanks, Alan. You're up, Nicholas.
Yeah, I would say supporting local farming and stuff. Like you can, I would agree with like going to local markets and supporting local farmers. I'm not sure I can think of much more of an answer at this moment.
That's all right, Nicholas. Thank you. Next up, Tony, what would your government do to encourage smaller entrepreneurs to get into?
Well, as Prime Minister and our government now. Well, before I get there, let me say Fran and I helped organize the first CSA in Ontario, community-supported agriculture at Bob and Bev Buds, quite a while ago now, and helped, through the Ecological Farmers Association, set up the CSA clearinghouse that was housed at the Maitland Valley Conservation Authority and provided information on how people could set up a CSA and do that on their farm, and had that there for many years. So I have some experience in this aspect. At the NDP level, we've been talking about a Canadian food strategy, how to make it simpler for young people and women to get into agriculture and to build a life on the farm. We'll work with the provinces to improve the training opportunities across the country and provide low-cost startup loans for new farmers, and support succession planning and end the unfair tax treatment of family farm transfers, making it easier for farms to stay in the family. This is on page 40 of our New Deal for People, if you'd like to see it in their writing. But finally, build on the pride and quality of our agricultural products in Canada here. We'll work with producers along the supply chain to increase the amount of Canadian food that's sold, processed, and consumed in local and regional markets. And that would also involve government procurement, so that we're actually creating markets in the government buildings and cafeterias, and also work with, the healthcare system in terms of our hospitals and other things. So, buying local, eating local makes a lot of sense, and buying fresh and eating fresh. You should come out to the farm right now. We've got really nice McIntosh apples, tree ripe. I should have brought brochures for Katrina. But, there's a lot we can do, but some of the real challenges are land pricing and how we deal with that.
Thanks, Tony. Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, well, for sure, of all the four candidates up here, nobody walks the talk like Tony McQuail. There's no doubt about that. So I've got a lot of respect for Tony, and he doesn't just talk it. He lives his life just like he says up here, so there's no doubt about it. I think really, though, it doesn't have to be one or the other. I think it can be both. We can have what we would consider traditional or conventional farming practices here today. They do a fantastic job. They feed Canada, they feed the cities, and in many cases they feed part of the world. So we have to thank them for that progressive agriculture and continue to support them. We also, though, are seeing more smaller farms producing food and selling them at markets. And certainly if we look at our Mennonite community just north of here, they're probably the best example. And they're not really interested in 100-acre farms. They're more interested in smaller acreages. And in other provinces, say for example in British Columbia, in certain parts, that's commonplace. So there's room and there's space for both. And if you've been to the Bruce Huron produce market in just east of Holyrood, you've seen it in action every Wednesday. So there's a great opportunity for both. And we're also seeing a transition. We're seeing farmers now look at the Ottawa Valley to purchase land and clean up land around there and farm up there. We're also seeing farmers purchasing land up near Hearst and Moonbeam and trying to make a go of it up there. So there are tremendous opportunities around. And in addition to that, there's a lot of technology now. There's a tech company in Kitchener called Local Line. There's local producers here that use that software to sell throughout Ontario. So there are lots of opportunities for both, and we should embrace each and every one of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. All right. So this question is addressed primarily to Alan and Ben, but we'll start with Ben because Alan had to start on the last one. And it's in regards to pipelines. So people may not like the tar sands, but they love gasoline. Why is the government and the Conservative Party supporting the, I can't read that word, it must be development or the something, sorry, whoever wrote that. The stripping of our natural resources, the shipment of our natural resources to China. There we go, I just had to read another line. To China, rather than promoting the creation of refineries across Canada. Sorry, that was a mouthful. Sorry, Ben.
No problem. Well, again, we can do both. We've talked about an east-west energy corridor, and it would be great to see a refinery, an Irving refinery in St. John, New Brunswick, refining Canadian oil instead of foreign oil. I think that would be a fantastic goal. Also, in regards to pipelines, think about how much oil is shipped in Western Canada on rail. To me, that's unacceptable. Not only does it impact emissions, shipping it all over Western Canada, but it also impacts grain delivery to Western ports. So that plays a big issue. In addition to that, LNG. We have huge opportunities in LNG in Western Canada. We have to maximize those opportunities. And a lot of that product is going to countries where there's high emissions. So earlier in the evening when I talked about the great story we have on technology and shipping it around the world, the more LNG that China uses, the lower the emissions we're going to have as a collective in this country, or not this country, but in the world. And to put it in perspective, CN Rail has created a thing called Canapucks. And it just shows kind of the absurdity when we don't have pipelines to get our oil to Tidewater, is they've actually found a way to use polymer to put oil in pucks so we can ship it like coal to China. Like, sometimes it is absurd what we're doing in this country, but certainly we need pipelines. We need to get world price. We should not be selling our oil at a discount to the United States and buying it back full price. That does not make sense for anybody. And we're missing out on billions and billions and billions of economic opportunities in this country because of what we're doing, that could build new schools, that could build new hospitals, and give us the world-class infrastructure we all desire.
Thanks, Ben. Go ahead, Alan.
So sometimes governments make controversial decisions, and I think you stand up and you explain them and you answer the question. And I do get the question from people on the doorsteps. How can you be talking about fighting climate change and buy a pipeline? So I'll tell you my answer. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We are embarking on a generation-long transition away from fossil fuels. We cannot flip the switch and turn this off right away. This is a transition. This will take time. And in the interim, the TMX pipeline does not mean the world will use more oil, just that Canada will have better access to global markets. The emissions from this pipeline, from TMX, are already included in our climate plan. We're in a transition, and the future of the energy industry will look very different than it does today. And every dollar invested by the federal government, every dollar that we earn from this pipeline project will be invested in this kind of generation-long clean energy transition. So we do have to find a way to square the circle, to walk and chew gum at the same time, and make controversial decisions and be willing to stand up and defend them. This is a complicated endeavor. There will not be easy solutions. And slogans like "leave the oil in the soil" are slogans. And so we have to look very long and hard at our economy. We are a resource-based economy. We can't turn off the tap right away. We need to find a way to make that transition.
Thank you, Alan. Nicholas?
In the short, well, we're still using fossil fuels as we were planning to get off of them. We would use them within the, use our own resources rather than importing or focusing on exporting, as we don't intend to keep using them for long. I believe the ban, we would stop using them by 2030, if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks, Nicholas. And Tony?
Well, friends, if I said, I got a lot of heroin here and I'm going to sell it and I'm going to reinvest the profits in rehab houses, what would you say about that? Alan talks about us having a generation. We had a generation 40 years ago. My daughters weren't born then. But we don't have a generation now. We're told we have 10 or 11 years. I didn't think I'd... Well, here, go ahead. Ben is my Vanna White. He does a great job on this. But I didn't think I'd have to use this at this meeting. But let us take a little refresher course in reality. The nature and the environment underpin the family and community, which underpins what we call the economy, which includes the public sector and the private sector. The economy that we're so worried about maintaining is not the bigger subset. But we've had an economic theory process that says economics is what's most important. You structure your society to serve economics, and, well, the environment just better look after itself because we're going to plunder it. Let me recommend this book to you, Donut Economics. It explains how our economists got so divorced from social reality, environmental reality, and economic reality, and then it offers some really brilliant ideas about how to create a regenerative and redistributive economy that would work for everybody. And the basic premise is, let's create an economy where we thrive, and we might grow, but we don't have to grow. And that's a really important idea. So, we don't have a generation. We're going to have to either bite the pill, or we're going to have to deal with a collapsing ecosystem, which is going to collapse the economy that we're so worried about. So, we really got to do this now.
Thank you, Tony. The third question and our last question tonight is in regards to recycling, and we'll be starting off with Tony. The question is addressed to everyone, but Tony's going to be going first. The question is, manufacturers, processors, etc., must be made accountable for the plastic they use to sell food products in. Will you legislate companies to sell products that can be compostable or renewable packaging?
Certainly, that's one aspect. But again, I was talking about rethinking and redesigning. What if all our bottles and containers were standardized and could take a canning lid, so that after you bought the stuff at the store, you could can in it yourself, or it could go back in a 12-pack box and go back to the store, and instead of being broken down and crushed and a whole lot of energy used to recycle it, it could just be washed and reused. What if we really thought about designing a whole bunch of packaging in that respect so that we don't need it? There's also the cradle to cradle or cradle to grave approach that says you design materials so they can be repaired, or the parts can be reutilized, or you design, and there's a whole new thinking of how you do good, sensible design like nature does. Because nature takes stuff and turns it into waste and composts it and turns it back into life. And that's what we need. We need to really start to mimic and understand the way nature manages the system, because it's been doing it for hundreds of millions of years, and that's part of why we're here. We've been managing it really since agriculture, 10,000 years, and we're about to knock ourselves off this planet. And so we really need to take a lesson from Mother Earth, because she's done a much better job. And that's where tuning into indigenous wisdom is also incredible. Let me recommend some books by Rupert Ross, which I found incredibly helpful in appreciating how much damage we've done as a settler community and how much knowledge we lost and could still possibly regain. So look up Rupert Ross. I think the books are available in the library system. But we've got a lot to learn, and a lot of humility would be a really good thing.
Thank you, Tony. Alan?
The simple answer is yes. Part of the proposal to legislate an end to single-use plastics is that companies that produce these products would bear financial responsibility for that waste.
Thank you, Alan. Ben?
Thank you. Certainly, plastic packaging has proliferated in the last number of years, and certainly with online purchases, I'm not one to do too many of those, but I have seen the packaging they come in, and it's kind of sickening, to be honest with you, to see the plastic. I don't believe you can recycle most of it, and the rest of it, I think, ends up in the trash. In addition, grocery stores, I think, Walmart, different companies like this, they bear a lot of the burden as well, and the responsibility that we can't cheap out. I mean, it wasn't that many years ago. It was paper grocery bags, not plastic grocery bags. You see the packaging in a grocery store. You used to be able to buy a melon or a watermelon and chop it yourself, and now you see there and it's in a single-use plastic container. It's ridiculous, really. So we need to completely reprogram the way we consume things. Even if you look at our furniture today, it's rare that someone would buy an actual piece of furniture that is, say, quarter-cut oak or pine. Most of it's single-use furniture. It's particle board. If you get it wet, you got to throw it in the garbage. And so there are so many different things we can do, but we really need industry, government, and consumers to all join together to have a more lasting legacy on what we're going to do here in the future, because it's ridiculous. Anybody that's been to a landfill or dump recently and you take a look at what gets thrown out, it will baffle your mind. And it's a real shame on all of us of what we throw out. And so we all need to do it, and we need to make our choices with companies that are producing products and selling products that don't have such a big impact on our environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Nicholas?
Yeah, I think yes would be the answer to that.
That's a good answer. Yes. So that's the end of the questions. So it's time for each candidate to be given 3 minutes to provide a closing statement. They will speak in the opposite order from drawn previously in the evening. The order is as follows: Tony, Alan, Nicholas, and Ben. So, Tony, your 3 minutes.
Well, friends, we need to get creative and imaginative and excited about what we can do locally. I don't know if you remember, but in 2008 election, I hitchhike around talking about a rideshare program. We could do that right now. We could have done it back then even, but if we start figuring out ways that we could do a little community cooperative Uber here in Huron Bruce, we could substantially reduce our fuel use with our existing vehicle technology by sharing rides and building community. I had a lot of fun talking to people on that. So, you know, that's just one little example of creative things we could be doing. And I know that there are a lot of creative people out there in Huron County. And Bruce, I'd like to draw your attention to something that I hope is out on our display table somewhere. And it's called, "Do We Love Our Machines More Than Our Children?" I wrote it 10 years ago. I've updated it and summarized it. But if you pick it up and would like the full thing, I'll be glad to send it to you. But that's the question we need to grapple with. Do we love our machines more than our children? Because that's the choice we're starting to face. You know, we've been trading liberal and conservative governments since before I first ran. So we've lost that generation of opportunity to move to a renewable energy, lower energy economy. But if we want to solve the climate change problem and address the issues of wealth inequality in our society, you know, talk is cheap, but it isn't going to address those problems. And so I think it's important to take a little look at the history of our political system. The liberals and conservatives have been serving the elite, the 1%, since the time of Confederation, and perhaps even before. And the reason you don't want the elites running things in a time of climate collapse or social collapse is that they're the last folks to feel the real impact of bad decisions. They're buffered from it by their wealth and their position of power. This book is called Conquest of the Land Through 7,000 Years, and a soil scientist from the USDA visited a lot of deserts that had lovely building remnants in them, and they had depleted their resource base. The problem with a global economy is we can do that globally. And that's the problem we're about to leave to our children and our grandchildren. So you don't want people who've been serving the elite for all this time to be the ones who are running society. As a New Democrat, I got involved in 1980 because I realized that the liberals and conservatives were serving the banks on the high interest policies that were hurting farmers, small business people, and homeowners. And I looked at the history and realized that the NDP traced itself back through the United Farmers, the CCF to the United Farmers and the independent labor folks who got the vote after the First World War. That's when women got the vote, and that's when working people got the vote. So that's our history. Because the question you really have to ask yourself is not who has the loveliest policies, but who has the guts and the strength and the commitment to actually implement those policies. And I'm really confused.
Yeah, that was, yeah. It was 3 minutes. Thank you, Tony. Sorry about the glitch there, technical difficulties with the timer. So, Alan, before you go, I'm just gonna check with our timekeeper. Do we have a 3-minute count? It was 3 minutes. Start time 1 minute yourself, and then start the 2-minute timer. So when you see the warnings, guys, those are your actual warnings, and then the mic will come off when it says 2, but it will in fact be 3.
And Tony got 3 minutes.
Tony did get 3 minutes. Yeah. All right, Alan's up.
So thank you to our hosts for organizing this event. We didn't have one of these 4 years ago, so we've come some distance in 4 years. And I kind of feel like those of us sitting up here owe you a bit of an apology. I think we've been a bit too scripted, and with our points, we were given the questions in advance. This is really complicated subject matter, and I guess we wanted to make sure we got it right. This, in the final analysis, is something that you should be able to speak to from the heart. This is the most important issue of our time, not just for the younger generation. I was at a senior's home the other day, and the questions coming from the 85-year-olds were about climate change. It's the most important issue of our time, which makes it arguably the most important issue of this election and the choice that you are going to have to make. And there is a real contrast, and this will be political. Andrew Scheer wants to make pollution free again. A conservative government would put at risk all the progress that Canada has made on fighting climate change in the last 4 years. The Liberals are the only federal party that has implemented a real plan to fight climate change. Do Canadians really want those of you here tonight who cared enough to come to a debate dedicated to the subject of our environment and the future of our planet? Do you really want to elect Andrew Scheer, who has promised to roll back carbon pricing on his first day in office? Or would you prefer a government, a party that can form a government, a party with a proven track record on the environment and a serious, ambitious plan to tackle climate change? That is the choice that you are going to be making. And Tony made an interesting point, one of many, a moment ago, how important it is to elect a party that will implement these policies. And this will irk some of my political opponents. But I think it is a political reality in this country that there are two parties represented on this stage who will have a chance to form a government. I encourage you to choose the party that is committed to stepping up the battle against climate change. You've heard a lot of words tonight. Actions can speak louder than words. If I could ask a question, I would ask Mr. Lobb, why did you choose not to participate in the climate strike events with our young people last week? Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Your turn, Nicholas.
Thanks everybody for coming tonight and listening to all the listening to the debate. It's an important issue. Different options. And we have an ambitious plan. I hope you'll consider voting green.
Thank you, Nicholas. And to wrap it up, Ben.
Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to participate in this debate tonight, environmental debate. I think for the most part, all the candidates tried to stay positive. You know, with Alan, he likes to talk out of both sides of his mouth about being positive. He'll tell you he wants to be positive, and then the next minute he's negative. The reality is that the Liberals have actually a pathetic record with the environment. It's a lot of talk and no action. And that's why the Green Party's polling where they're at, and that's why the NDP are polling where they're at. And I wouldn't say for sure that it's anybody's given election at this point. I think past elections have shown us that anybody can win. The Liberal targets are Stephen Harper's targets. So Justin Trudeau and Alan Thompson really, I guess, should thank Stephen Harper for those targets. We learned last night that Justin Trudeau has 2 planes, and the one plane that he uses to carry his cargo around is a 40-year-old plane that burns 1,000 gallons of airplane fuel per hour. The Liberals bought a pipeline. Can you believe that? The Liberal government that was going to fight climate change bought a pipeline. So they're in bed with the oil industry now, this great party that's going to be the freedom fighters on the environment. So I just wanted to set that record straight. That's not the speech I wanted to give in my closing statement. I wanted to tell you all the great things that we were going to do. I'm proud of Andrew Scheer and the Conservative Party that they have a 50-page plus environmental policy, an environmental platform that does deal with issues, that does lay it out in plain language. And I think that's great. We've come a long ways. We've come such a long ways in 10 years of all the political parties, but certainly with ours, I'm so proud of what we have done, and we've taken it very seriously. We want to see everybody succeed. We're concerned about our youth. We know what it means. We're going to balance the economy and the environment. We produce things environmentally, ethically. We have the highest labor standards in the world. It's no longer one party is the party of the environment. I believe all the parties up here tonight love the environment, love the earth, and want to see us succeed each and every day. So I thank each and every one of you for coming out here tonight. I think we've had a great debate. I want to thank Jeff for what he's done. As a host, I want to thank my old colleague Tony for keeping the time. That's what he used to do at Westcast too. He'd tell me the machine would be ready in 3 minutes, and it was ready in 2 minutes. So thanks for Tony. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Ben. All right, so that's it for the candidates tonight. I want to thank you, audience members, and thank the candidates for participating in this national project and demonstrating your support for the environment, as it is an important issue in the federal election. Thank you to those tuning in via Rogers TV. Thank you to the debate organizers for your coordination and hard work. Thank you to all the volunteers for giving their time to this important event. And finally, thank you to Lakeshore United Church for providing us with this amazing space. I encourage all of you to vote on October 21st. It is of the utmost importance. The candidates will stick around until 9:15 p.m. if you wish to talk with them directly. And just before we sign off, Betty Durst, the co-chair of Green Goderich, would like to come up and say a couple words. Can you turn on Tony's mic?
Thank you can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much. I just want to say a few words of thanks. Green Goderich early in the summer had this idea about having an environmental debate, an all candidates environmental debate, because lots of times in all candidates meetings, the environment just kind of gets disappears. So we wanted a debate or an evening of just about the environment. So this, so here we are here. We just thought we wanted to make the environment front and center. We have a few people to thank, in particular Bob Payne. Where is he? Is he here? No. Okay, we wanted to say thanks to Bob because we had the idea, but at the Celtic Festival we ran into Bob Payne, and he really encouraged the idea of this event. And then we also want to thank Mark Woodward, the CAO from the Huron Chamber. And where is Mark? Oh, there he is up there. Without your support, you gave us tremendous support, and thanks so much for making the hosting of this so much easier. And last but not least, we want to say thanks to Alex Robinson. And there she is there. She took this on in a really big way and waded through all the details and coordinated it all and made it happen. Thanks so much. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight. And safe trip home, everyone. Thank you.
So yeah, I think that we're just going to, you're free to leave. You can speak with the candidates, but that's the end of the formal portion of our debate. And we told these guys that they could leave at 9:15. So, but I'm sure they'd like to talk to you even longer if they had the chance.